December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Dawn does not break, it simply bleeds from black to a bruised, oppressive gray. A low, freezing fog clings to the snow-drifted firs of the Ardennes, for the young. American soldiers of the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, this is a ghost front, quiet. Miserable, a place to recuperate from the brutal fighting in the Huichin forest. The silence is absolute, a heavy, crystalline blanket muffling the world. Then a low rumble disturbs the stillness, not from the sky but from the east, it grows. Vibrating through the frozen ground, the deep-throated growl of hundreds of panzer engines. At 5:30 a.m., the horizon erupts. A hellish, orchestrated barrage of thousands of German artillery shells tears the forest. Apart, trees splinter into matchsticks, geysers of earth and snow vomit into the air. The world dissolves into concussion and flame. Through the smoke and the lingering fog, dark shapes emerge, monstrous king tiger. Tanks their long 88mm guns spearing forward, followed by grenadiers in winter white. Camouflage. The Wehrmacht is not just attacking, it is unleashing its last, desperate gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, its goal, to split the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. For the stunned GIs in their foxholes, this is the stuff of nightmares, a colossal, overwhelming force they were told was defeated, but for the German high command, watching their elite divisions plunge into the American line, there is a different, more profound anxiety. It is not a fear of the initial, chaotic resistance, it is the chilling, unspoken question: how long will it take for the American giant to react, to comprehend, to adapt, and to unleash its most terrifying asset, not a single weapon, but a relentless, systemic ingenuity that could, in a matter of days, turn this stunning offensive into their final, definitive defeat. To understand the true nature of the Wehrmacht's fear, one must first understand the two opposing forces that collided in the European theater. They were not just armies of different nations, they were manifestations of entirely different civilizations, cultures, and industrial philosophies. On one side stood the German Wehrmacht of 1944, a battle-hardened, professional force honed by years of combat on the Eastern Front. It was a military built on a foundation of Auftragstaktik, a decentralized command philosophy that empowered junior officers to use their initiative to achieve a commander's intent. This system, combined with formidable weaponry like the Tiger and Panther tanks, the MG-42 machine gun, and a deep-seated operational audacity, had made the German army the most tactically proficient and feared fighting force in the world. But by the late summer of 1944, this formidable machine was bleeding out. The disastrous campaign in Russia had consumed millions of men and mountains of material. The Allied landings in Normandy had forced a brutal war of attrition on a second front. The German war economy, despite Albert Speer's efficiencies, was a brittle thing shattered by round-the-clock strategic bombing. Fuel was desperately scarce. Replacements for lost men and machines were younger, older, and less trained. The Wehrmacht was a master swordsman, but his blade was notched, his arm weary, and his resources dwindling. Facing them was a force that defied traditional European military understanding: the United States Army. In 1939, the U.S. Army was smaller than Portugal's, ranking 19th in the world. Its doctrine was outdated, its equipment often obsolete, but America possessed something no other nation could match: the latent potential of its industrial and innovative might. This was not merely about producing more tanks and bullets, it was about a national character steeped in pragmatism, mass production, and a relentless drive to find a better way. This ethos was embodied in the arsenal of democracy. American factories did not just build weapons, they engineered them for simplicity, durability, and volume. The Sherman tank, often maligned for its lighter armor and smaller gun compared to its German counterparts, was a masterpiece of this philosophy. It was reliable, easy to maintain and could be produced in staggering numbers, nearly 50,000 during the war. A single broken track on a King Tiger could immobilize it for days, waiting for a specialized recovery vehicle. A Sherman could be repaired by its crew with a spare part, and a wrench often within hours. This industrial foundation was the bedrock, but the true American weapon was how. This capacity for mass production was married to a culture of adaptive problem-solving. On the battlefield, the U.S. military was a learning organism. It absorbed the shock of initial contact with the veteran Wehrmacht, analyzed its failures, and evolved at a breathtaking pace. This was not the rigid, top-down ingenuity of a single brilliant mind, but a distributed, systemic ingenuity that flourished from the general down to the sergeant. And it was this system that was about to be tested in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a place where the Wehrmacht's last, desperate gamble would collide with America's greatest strength. By mid-December 1944, the Western Front had, to Allied eyes, stabilized into a brutal but predictable war of attrition. The Allied line, stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, was thick in some sectors, thin in others. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff viewed the Ardennes, the same densely wooded, hilly region through which the Germans had unleashed their blitzkrieg in 1940, as unsuitable for major offensive. It was a quiet sector, used to rest battered divisions and break in new ones. The terrain, with its narrow, winding roads and limited avenues of approach, was believed to be a natural defensive barrier. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Adolf Hitler himself conceived the audacious plan. He saw not a defensive barrier, but a corridor of concealment. He would use the harsh winter weather as his ally, grounding the overwhelming Allied air forces. Under this cloak of cloud and fog, his last remaining panzer armies would smash through the thin American line, race for the Meuse River, and then drive on to the ultimate prize, the port of Antwerp. The capture of Antwerp would strangle the entire Allied supply chain. Politically, it would shatter the Anglo-American alliance, perhaps even forcing a separate peace. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing roll of the dice. The force assembled for this blow, the 6th Panzer Army under the fanatical SS Obergruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, and the 5th Panzer Army under the skilled General Hasso von Manteuffel, was the last strategic reserve of the Third Reich. It was a ghost army moved into position with meticulous radio silence and camouflaged in the Eifel forests opposite the Ardennes. It included the finest remaining Waffen-SS units, such as the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler, equipped with the latest King Tiger tanks, but the force was a paradox, a glittering spearhead with a brittle shaft. Fuel was so scarce that the entire operation was predicated on capturing American fuel. Dumps intact, many divisions were filled with green recruits or conscripts from conquered territories, their morale fragile. Opposing this gathering storm were 6 American divisions, totaling about 80,000 men. Many, like the 28th Infantry Division, were battle-hardened in the sense that they had been mauled in the Huitjin forest and sent to this quiet sector to recover. The 106th Infantry Division was brand new, having just arrived from the United States days before, and taking over a wide, difficult-to-defend section of the front. Their positions were thin. Their intelligence reports of German buildups were dismissed by higher commands, convinced the Wehrmacht was incapable of a major offensive. Then the storm broke. The initial German artillery barrage was one of the most concentrated of the entire war. In the west, for over an hour, a thunderous rain of high explosives and rockets fell upon the American front lines, severing communication wires, destroying command posts, and inflicting a profound psychological shock. In the pre-dawn darkness, under the cover of searchlights reflecting off the low clouds to create artificial moonlight, German infantry and assault engineers, many equipped with the terrifying shrieking Nebelwerfer rockets, surged forward. The American line, in many places, simply dissolved, isolated platoons and companies were overrun in their foxholes. Confusion reigned, but even in these first chaotic hours, something remarkable occurred where the line was supposed to collapse entirely. Individual American soldiers, squad leaders, and junior officers made stand after stand. At the Losham Gap, in the villages of Hofen and Monschau, and on the narrow roads, snaking through the forest, pockets of GIs delayed the German spearheads with desperate, often suicidal courage. They blew bridges, laid hasty minefields, and fought from isolated strongpoints, buying time with their lives. This was not part of a grand, coordinated plan. It was the raw, unorganized expression of a military culture that valued individual initiative. The delay was minimal, but in a plan dependent on speed and timetable, every hour lost was critical. The Wehrmacht's greatest fear, the unpredictable, tenacious resistance of the American soldier, was already beginning to manifest. The American military's greatest asset was not its equipment, but the quality of its individual soldier. In stark contrast to the Wehrmacht's increasingly rigid hierarchy, the U.S. Army fostered a culture of pragmatic problem-solving at the lowest levels. This was the war of the sergeant and the lieutenant, cut off from headquarters, surrounded by the fog of war. These junior leaders did not wait for orders. They assessed, they adapted, they improvised. When the 5th Panzer Army spearheads smashed through the front, they bypassed numerous small units, leaving them as isolated islands of resistance. These pockets, like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, are legendary, but countless smaller pockets formed spontaneously. A squad leader, finding his platoon severed, would gather stragglers from other shattered units, cooks, clerks, mechanics, arm them and organize defense of a crossroads. A young lieutenant, his company reduced to a handful of men, would use the terrain, mining a narrow forest trail and setting up ambushes with bazookas. This was not blind heroism, it was applied ingenuity. They learned to identify the weak spots on the massive German tanks, the thinner side and rear armor. They discovered that a white phosphorus grenade could blind a tiger, allowing a bazooka team to maneuver for a killing shot. They used the confusion of the fog and forest to their advantage, creating the illusion of greater strength. The German advance, planned with Teutonic precision, found itself bogged down in 100 small, unplanned, and vicious firefights, each one a tiny delay, each delay a drop of fuel wasted, an hour of daylight lost. The Wehrmacht, a master of the set-piece battle, was now forced to fight 1,000 sergeants' wars. While junior leaders fought their isolated battles, a broader tactical ingenuity was taking shape. The initial shock was profound, but the American command structure, though reeling, did not shatter. Instead, it began to exhibit a remarkable flexibility. The U.S. Army's doctrine, unlike the static defense philosophies of World War I, emphasized mobility and counter-punching. The first and most critical decision was made by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. Within hours of the attack, they recognized this was not a local diversion, but a major offensive. While Berlin was plunged into chaos, the Allied response was calm and decisive. Eisenhower's famous words to his staff encapsulated the shift from shock to opportunity. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. This mindset filtered down, instead of trying to re-establish a solid, continuous line. Task impossible in the chaos, commanders like Generals Omar Bradley and Courtney Hodges began to orchestrate a fluid, elastic defense. They identified key terrain, the vital road junctions at St. Vith and Bastogne, and funneled reinforcements to them. The 7th Armored Division executed a desperate road march to bolster St. Vith. The 101st and 82nd Airborne, in rest camps near Reims, were thrown into trucks and raced to the front. The famous truck-borne ride to Bastogne. This was the antithesis of the German plan. The Wehrmacht expected the Americans to fall back in disarray, creating a clean corridor to the Meuse. Instead, they found their flanks constantly harassed and their spearheads funneled into fortified shoulders to the north and south of the bulge. The advance became a narrow, vulnerable salient. Pushing against a defense that bent but would not break, the Americans were not just defending, they were shaping the battlefield, channeling the German strength into killing zones where it could be contained and then cut off. If the German approach to technology was that of a master watchmaker, the American approach was that of a grease-stained mechanic in a well-stocked garage, the U.S. Army. In the Ardennes became a vast, distributed workshop where standardized equipment and a can-do attitude overcame technical shortcomings with breathtaking speed. The most iconic example is the Rhino tank, the Sherman, outgunned by German heavy tanks, found a new lethality not from a factory but from the field, faced with the dense tank-trapping hedgerows of the Bocage in Normandy earlier that year. A sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., had devised a simple solution: weld steel tusks from German beach obstacles to the front of a Sherman. This Rhino could plow through hedgerows instead of climbing them, exposing its vulnerable underside. The idea was tested, approved, and within weeks, using salvaged steel, 3 out of 4 First Army tanks were fitted with these devices. This was systemic ingenuity in action. A problem was identified, a low-tech solution was invented by a junior soldier, and it was rapidly disseminated and implemented on a massive scale. In the Ardennes, this ethos intensified. Maintenance units worked around the clock, not just repairing damaged vehicles, but cannibalizing wrecks to keep others running. The critical shortage of artillery shells was alleviated by a Herculean logistical effort that rerouted entire supply trains. When the weather cleared, the true technological advantage of the Allies' air power was unleashed with devastating effect, but even here it was the American system that shone. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a robust fighter bomber, was transformed into a tank killer through field-modified ordnance. Its pilots developed the Cabrank system, loitering over the battlefield in constant communication with ground controllers to strike targets of opportunity within minutes. This seamless integration of air and ground was a form of tactical technology the Wehrmacht could not replicate. The German military revered the warrior genius, the Rommel, the Manstein, the model whose personal brilliance could shape a battle. The American military, by contrast, trusted in the system of command. Its most successful generals were not flamboyant tacticians, but brilliant managers and team builders. At the top was Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme coalition manager. His genius lay not in devising complex operational plans, but in his ability to hold a fractious alliance together, to allocate resources, and to empower his subordinates. When the bulge erupted, his immediate decision to give command of the northern shoulder of the offensive to the aggressive British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, while controversial, was a masterstroke of organizational management, ensuring clear and unified command lines during the crisis. Below him were men like Omar Bradley, the calm, dependable GI general, and thus fiery George S. Patton. Patton's subsequent actions would become the stuff of legend. But his true brilliance was not merely his audacity, it was his command of the machinery of war. When ordered to disengage his Third Army from its eastward attack, wheel at 90 degrees and drive north to relieve Bastogne, he did not hesitate. He had already foreseen the possibility and had his staff prepare contingency plans. The movement of over 250,000 men and their equipment on icy, congested roads in the dead of winter was a logistical ballet of unparalleled complexity. It was a testament to a command system that valued planning, staff work, and the delegation of authority. The German command, by contrast, was plagued by Hitler's micromanagement and the bitter rivalries between the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. The Americans were fighting a modern managerial war. The Germans were still relying on the fading aura of a single failing warlord. The final and perhaps most decisive angle was psychological. The Wehrmacht's plan was a psychological one, to deliver a stunning blow that would shatter American morale and break the Allied will. They failed catastrophically in this objective. The American soldiers' morale was not built on Nazi-like ideological fervor, but on something more durable, a belief in his own competence, the reliability of his comrades, and the sheer weight of the system backing him. He knew that if he was wounded, a medic would try to reach him. He knew that if he was low on ammunition, a supply truck would likely get through. He knew that if he held his position, reinforcements were on the way. This created a resilience that baffled the Germans. Nowhere was this more powerfully demonstrated than in the siege of Bastogne, when the German parley arrived on December 22nd with a demand for the honorable surrender of the 101st Airborne. The acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's legendary laconic response, "Nuts," was not just bravado, it was the distilled essence of this unbreakable morale. It was the response of a commander who, though surrounded, low on ammunition, and facing overwhelming force, had absolute faith in his men and the certainty that Patton's Third Army was driving hard to relieve them. This psychological fortitude, this refusal to accept the tactical reality of their situation, turned a defensive stand into a symbol that galvanized the entire Allied front. The Wehrmacht had bet everything on breaking the American spirit, and in Bastogne and across the Ardennes, that spirit proved to be its greatest and most terrifying adversary. The multifaceted nature of the American response, from the workshop floor to the command tent, has been established. This systemic ingenuity was now poised to transform a desperate defense into a decisive counterblow. The turning point of the Battle of the Bulge was not a single, dramatic cavalry charge, but a series of interlocking events, a symphony of coordinated pressure that reached its crescendo between December 22nd and 26th, 1944, the German spearheads having sacrificed their timetable in the bloody sergeant's wars and been funneled by the elastic defense, were now deep inside the Bulge, overextended, low on fuel, and exposed. The first and most critical element was the weather. For 7 days, low clouds and fog had been the Wehrmacht's greatest ally, grounding the Allied tactical air forces. This was the precondition for the entire offensive, but on the morning of December 23rd, a meteorological miracle occurred. A high-pressure system swept across the Ardennes, bringing freezing temperatures, but also crystal-clear, brilliant blue skies. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for the Germans. From dawn, the skies over Belgium filled with the drone of thousands of aircraft. The Allied air forces, pent up and waiting, were unleashed with a fury the world had never seen. Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swept down, strafing and bombing anything that moved on the narrow, snow-covered roads. See 47 Dakotas in vast, vulnerable armadas droned overhead, dropping vital supplies to the besieged garrisons. At Bastogne and Saint-Vith, for the first time, the German soldier, who had advanced under the comforting cloak of overcast, was naked and exposed. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The constant, terrifying presence of Allied aircraft shattered the illusion of German air superiority and hammered home the reality of their isolation. On the ground, the siege of Bastogne became the focal point of the entire battle. The 101st Airborne and elements of the 10th Armored Division, though surrounded, were not passive. They conducted aggressive patrols, counterattacked to retake lost positions, and turned the Belgian town into a fortress. Their artillery, expertly directed by forward observers, exacted a terrible toll on every German assault. The town itself became a black hole, sucking in German divisions that were desperately needed for the drive west to the Meuse. Every hour the paratroopers held was an hour the German strategic plan disintegrated further. To the south, the relentless drive of George Patton's Third Army was a masterpiece of operational ingenuity. The 90-degree turn had been executed with stunning speed. Now the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were clawing their way north, fighting through determined German rearguards at every village and crossroads. Their mission was simple, brutal, and urgent: break through to Bastogne. The corridor they had to punch through was defended by the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, a tough, experienced unit. The fighting was house to house, field to field in sub-zero temperatures, but the momentum was now with the Americans. They were attacking. Supplied and supported from the air, the Germans were defending a collapsing position, their supply lines under constant aerial attack. The initiative had irrevocably shifted. The noose is tightening. The skies are clear. Bastogne holds, and Patton's fist is hammering at the door. The climax now reaches its peak with the brutal, close quarters battle for the relief corridor itself. The final push to Bastogne was a brutal, incremental struggle, measured in yards and paid for in blood. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command RCCR, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, was the spearhead. Abrams, a aggressive and brilliant tank commander whose name would later grace the U.S. Army's main battle tank, led from the front. His personal Sherman, Thunderbolt, was a symbol of the relentless pressure being applied. The German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, though outgunned and undersupplied, fought with the tenacity of men who knew the stakes. They laid clever ambushes, sowed the roads with Tellermans, and used the few remaining anti-tank guns to deadly effect. Each small Belgian hamlet, Assenois, Clochemont, Cibret, became a fortress that had to be cleared in bitter house-to-house fighting. The advance was a series of violent, sharp engagements under the cold, clear sky, the crack of tank fire and the rattle of machine guns echoing across the snow-blanketed fields. On the afternoon of December 26th, the lead element of CCR was a task force under Lieutenant Charles Boggess. His column of Shermans and half-tracks was stalled outside the village of Assenois, the last major German strongpoint blocking the road to Bastogne. The village was a hornet's nest of German paratroopers, artillery, and mortar. Fire rained down, pinning the American infantry. What happened next was a calculated act of audacity, born from the urgency of the mission. Boggess, coordinating with artillery, made a fateful decision. He called for time-on-target artillery strike, a complex barrage where shells from multiple batteries are timed to land on a target simultaneously, giving the enemy no time to take cover. The coordinates were set for the center of Assenois. The sky screamed as the massed American artillery delivered its payload with pinpoint accuracy. The village disappeared in a unified cataclysm of explosions and smoke. Before the dust had settled, without waiting for a clearance signal, Boggess ordered his tanks to charge. "We're going through that town," he radioed. "Don't stop for anything." His Sherman, Cobra King, led the charge, crashing through the shattered debris of Assenois at high speed. German paratroopers, stunned by the barrage, emerged from cellars and ruins, only to be met by machine gun fire from the charging half-tracks. It was a desperate, violent gauntlet run. Tanks fired canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells, into buildings and tree lines at point-blank range. Breaking out the northern side of the village, Boggess's small column raced down the final open stretch of road toward the American lines surrounding Bastogne. Through his binoculars, he scanned the distant woods. He saw foxholes, then he saw the helmets of the men inside them. They were American. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Boggess raised himself through the hatch of Cobra King and shouted to the figures in the foxholes, "I'm from the 4th Armored Division. We're here to relieve you." The first soldier to greet him, a lieutenant from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion of the 101st, simply replied, "I'm damned glad to see you." The corridor was open. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The link-up was not the end of the battle. Vicious fighting to widen the corridor would continue for days, but it was the definitive turning point. The news flashed through the American command. Massive boost to morale. For the Germans, it was the final, undeniable confirmation that Their great offensive had failed. The Americans had not been shattered, they had been bloodied, and in their response, they had demonstrated a systemic resilience and a capacity for violent, focused ingenuity that crushed the last, best hope of the Third Reich. In the West, the master swordsman had been defeated by the master mechanic. The breaking of the siege of Bastogne did not end the battle, it transformed it. The Wehrmacht, stubborn and defiant, did not instantly collapse. Hitler, refusing to acknowledge reality, ordered his armies to continue the attack, shifting the main effort to a renewed assault on Bastogne in early January. This decision only deepened the catastrophe, wasting irreplaceable men and material in a futile battle of attrition against an enemy that grew stronger by the hour. The final, systematic reduction of the Bulge was a masterclass in American operational art. With the weather now consistently clear, Allied air power operated with impunity. Fighter bombers prowled the skies in tankbuster patrols, destroying hundreds of German vehicles and making daylight movement suicidal. The skies belonged to the Allies, and they used this dominance to strangle the German armies trapped in the salient. On the ground, the U.S. First and Third Armies began a massive, coordinated pincer movement. From the north, units like the 2nd Armored Division slammed into the tip of the German spear near Celles, just a few miles from the Meuse River, in a series of violent armored engagements that annihilated the 2nd Panzer Division. From the south, Patton's forces, now reinforced, pushed relentlessly northward, widening the Bastogne corridor and threatening to encircle the entire 5th Panzer Army. The advance was methodical, brutal, and powered by an inexhaustible supply of artillery shells. American guns fired at a rate the fuel-starved and shell-short Germans could not hope to match, pulverizing defensive positions before the infantry and tanks moved in. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge was being squeezed out of existence. On January 16, after weeks of brutal fighting, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division from the north linked up with elements of the 3rd Army from the south at the town of Houffalize, formally closing the neck of the salient. The battlefield they reclaimed was a frozen wasteland of horror. The human cost was staggering. The United States suffered over 75,000 casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, including approximately 19,000 killed, making it the bloodiest battle in American history. The landscape was littered with the detritus of war, shattered Shermans and burned-out Panthers, frozen bodies in snow-filled foxholes, and the personal effects of the fallen from both sides. For the survivors, the experience was seared into their memory: the cold, the constant artillery, the sight of comrades killed by an enemy they had believed was defeated. The initial shock of the attack had been replaced by a hardened, bitter resolve. For the Germans, the price was fatal. Their losses were estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, but these numbers tell only part of the story. The true loss was qualitative. The Ardennes offensive had consumed the last of the Wehrmacht's strategic reserves in the west, the elite Waffen-SS Panzer divisions. The backbone of the offensive were hollowed out, their veteran manpower gone, their prized tanks destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe, which had thrown its last reserves into the operation in a disastrous New Year's Day raid, was now a spent force. The German army in the west was broken, incapable of mounting anything more than a desperate, delaying defense. The strategic consequences of the failed Ardennes offensive were immediate and irreversible. The Western Allies, though bloodied, emerged from the crisis stronger and more united. The shock of the attack had temporarily papered over the simmering tensions between the British and American commands, forcing a level of cooperation that would smooth the path for the final invasion of Germany. The victory also provided a massive psychological boost. The American army had been tested in the crucible of the Wehrmacht's finest remaining units and had not only survived but triumphed. The GIs who had fought in the Bulge now possessed a hard-won confidence that made them the equals of any soldier in the world. For Germany, the battle was an unmitigated disaster from which it could not recover. The staggering losses in men and materiel meant that when the Soviets launched their massive Vistula offensive on January 12, 1945, they met a ghost army, the Eastern Front, already stretched to breaking, completely collapsed. German forces were transferred east in a desperate, futile attempt to stem the Soviet tide, leaving the West virtually undefended. The Ardennes had, in effect, guaranteed the rapid Soviet advance to the gates of Berlin and ensured there would be no fortified national redoubt in the Alps. Hitler's last gamble had accelerated his own demise. The true legacy of the Bulge, however, lies in the stark contrast it revealed between the two warring nations. A post-battle analysis by the U.S. Army's Historical Division quoted a captured German officer who expressed a sentiment that had become commonplace. Among his comrades, we could understand your production of tanks, your air force, your artillery, but we could not understand the American infantryman. He was not a fanatic. He did not fight with the desperation of our men or the Russians, but he fought with a calm, tenacious competence that we found baffling, and he always seemed to have what he needed to fight with. This was the essence of the American ingenuity the Wehrmacht had come to fear. It was not a single technological marvel, but a deeply embedded system, a system that could replace a lost Sherman in days, while a German Panther was lost for weeks, a system that could reroute an entire army in 72 hours, a system that empowered a sergeant to innovate a tank modification and a lieutenant to lead a relief column. It was the triumph of a flexible, industrial, and democratic society over a rigid, ideological, and brittle one. The battlefield had been a brutal testing ground, and the American system of war, pragmatic, adaptive, and overwhelmingly logistically supported, had proven decisively superior. The Wehrmacht's greatest fear was realized. They had not been defeated by a single weapon, but by a relentless, systemic capacity to solve problems and regenerate combat power that they simply could not match. The snows of the Ardennes eventually melted. The shattered trees slowly regrew there, new leaves covering the scars of battle. The frozen bodies were recovered, the metal husks of tanks and guns hauled away for scrap. The Battle of the Bulge faded from the headlines, becoming another chapter in the vast, grim narrative of the Second World War. But its legacy endures, not merely as a tale of courage and sacrifice, though it is that abundance. It stands as a timeless case study in the very nature of conflict. It demonstrates that victory in modern war is seldom the product of a singular genius or a wonder weapon. It is, instead, the result of a deeply embedded national capacity, resilience that is woven into the fabric of an army and the society it serves. The Wehrmacht feared American ingenuity because it was an opponent they could not outthink in the long run. They could devise a brilliant operational plan, but they could not stop the Americans from adapting to it. They could build a technologically superior tank, but they could not stop the Americans from finding a way to destroy it, or from producing 10 simpler tanks for every one of theirs. They could strike a devastating blow, but they could not stop the American system from absorbing the shock, reorganizing and counterattacking with overwhelming force. The GIs in their foxholes, the mechanics in their muddy workshops, the logisticians with their clipboards, the generals in their command posts, they were all components of the same organic learning machine. This was the true arsenal of democracy, not just a production line of weapons, but a production line of solutions. In the end, the frozen fields of Belgium and Luxembourg bear witness to a profound truth. The greatest weapon is not the one that strikes the hardest initial blow, but the system that can endure, adapt, and prevail. It is a lesson written in the snow and blood of the Bulge, a lesson about the enduring strength of a free people when their ingenuity is marshaled in the cause of liberty. The Wehrmacht's last, desperate gamble had shattered against this unyielding reality.